right, here we are again. So, ladies and gentlemen, the next presenter is Cynthia Wells, and Cynthia comes all the way to us from North Carolina. Yes, so her legs are pretty tired, but she's going to try and stand for the entire presentation. Cynthia's been doing genetic genealogy for quite a while and has had a lot of success with genetic genealogy and DNA testing in her own family. So she's going to share with us some of her experiences, particularly from an Irish-American perspective. So can I ask you to please put your hands together and give a big welcome to Cynthia Wells.
Well, thank you. We've had some excellent talks in the last couple of days here, and I'm approaching my talk as an ordinary person who does genealogy and family history, who's been doing DNA genealogy for almost 10 years now, and sharing the experiences I've had, not only personal in my family, but through my DNA projects. I have a very diverse DNA history. It does include Irish ancestry, and a lot of my project members have Irish ancestry. So hopefully there are some tips and some methods and just some results that each of you can take with your projects and helping with your family history. Upside down, that always. Okay. DNA complements family history. When you use genealogical DNA, these are definite items that I've been able to do. Reestablish relationships where the paper trail went cold. It's provided research clues to break down brick walls. It's linked families where the surname has gone through spelling changes. It's validated or disproved oral family traditions. It's identified previously unknown genetic kin. It's identified errors in paper trails. It's identified ancestral origins, and it also has ruled out others with the same surname as being related. And that last point is important because if you have a common surname and it's in multiple locations, or there's multiple families in one location, just because the paper trail looks like they're all related, the DNA helps to either disprove or validate, so you don't spend a lot of time, a lot of effort and money searching records if they're not your ancestors or relatives. My first story, this is Jewel McKinney. She is a female member of my lay DNA surname project, and she descends from maternal mtDNA Irish ancestry. Taking an mtDNA test, it's hit or miss for a lot of people, but she has had success in actually having exact matches and actually validating her Irish ancestry up at least until the 1700s. That is, as I said, Jewel. And this is her mom, Bertha, and Ted. That's her parents. And this picture is Etta. This is her grandmother. And she was tested I2. And I went out to Wikipedia, and I2 is most commonly found here in Northwestern Europe. And it's here in Ireland, at least at the time that this study was done, in 2.34%. There is another website out there that it's gone up to about 3%, which is increases in the database. Now, what's interesting about I2 for Irish mtDNA is that It doesn't have, it's been absent from ancient European samples, but as far as Roman Iron Age sites, as far as the sample size, in the sample size of 24, which admittedly is small, but 12.5% in Viking Age burial sites, 13.79 with the database size of 29, and Anglo-Saxon burial sites, 48, 2.08. Another interesting thing I found was that it's at its highest frequency in Brittany, France. And looking at a map, Brittany is right there on the coastline, and thinking back 1,000 years or more, it would have been easy to make a trip over across the water there, and either through England on into Ireland or just a straight shot there. Now, this is Larry over here, and he's one of Jules' matches. As you can see, she's got an exact match, and 6 come from Ireland, and she has identified 4 of those 6, and Larry has agreed to show his handsome face at my presentation here. And these are some of the locations that the ancestor, the MTDNA ancestor, is located. County Mayo, Ulster, Ireland, and as Larry likes to say, his MTDNA Irish maternal ancestry is beyond the pale. That's how he likes to term it. And some of the surnames that are associated with these women were Burke, Kennedy, Corcoran, and Mayfield, and I think that is your surname. Right, okay, all right, well, you may need to get up with Jewel there. So that is a successful mtDNA story. A lot of people shy away from mtDNA just because women's names historically change within marriage, and if you already have a brick wall, it's slow goings. But Jewel, she's retired and is a jewel of a researcher, and she's been doing her homework. Now moving on, this handsome fellow, this is my dad. And we're going to move away from Ireland for this story. But I had my brother test for our father's ancestry, which is Polish-Russian. It's Eastern European. And the initial test, it came out to be a haplogroup N, which is Siberia, Scandinavia, and it is into Poland there. But he had one match. I wasn't even expecting a match in the database. And he matches a Mr. Chang. Now, I know Mr. Chang, he's a doctor, and he actually lives in the States. But he was born and raised and took his schooling in Korea. And I'm going, I obviously do not look Oriental, but I like having that ancestry. So Dr. Spencer Wells, who heads up the National Genealogy Project, and that's an international DNA project, he came to talk in Charlotte, which is where I work at the local university. And so he was standing by the hors d'oeuvre table before his dinner presentation, and he was by himself. And I thought, you know what? He won't remember me tomorrow, and I've got questions to ask him. And so I thought, let's go with it. So I got him aside and started talking about my paternal test there that my brother did, and I told him haplogroup N. Well, right out of the bat, before I got a chance to finish, he immediately says, oh, Scandinavian. And I says, no. I said, on a 12 marker match, and my brother has gone out to 111 now, but this remains his only match at 12 markers. I says, it's with a Korean. I says, what gives? And so he said that my brother's mtDNA is a remnant probably, most likely, that came out of Asia with the Mongolian invaders back in the 13th century. And if you notice from this map, this is in the 13th century. This was the Mongol Empire. This is a Korean peninsula here. And here's Russia, Eastern Europe. So that is a personal story that I found fascinating. I don't look Oriental, and I certainly do not have their math ability. I wish I had. But I love knowing that I've got Oriental ancestry. I would have never known that without doing a DNA test. And to take it one step further, now FTDNA, which is who my family's tested through, they had a DNA test a couple years ago called Walk Through the Y. They were trying to find new markers, new SNPs, to help expand the Y tree. So I've got it circled here. Remember what Spencer Wells said, that we were an older branch of the N haplogroup tree. These are trees that are usually associated with Scandinavia, younger trees. And what I mean by that is when the mutation, when this branch of the tree first appeared. And the lab found new SNPs. And so my brother and his match, and I believe there's one more in the database, we've got our own tree now. So that's a nice story, that without testing, each one of you can have a unique story. It may not be this particular haplogroup, and I know that R1b is a predominant haplogroup here in Ireland, but without testing, you never know. Origins of a surname. Now, surnames weren't always around, and they started about 500-600 years ago, and some surnames were associated even with the Norman conquerors. I am associated with the Tally Surname Project. I'm a co-admin there, and we have project members that definitely have Irish ancestry, and they're coming out of Tyrone. And I also had a customer yesterday at the table. He pronounced it Tyrone. So Tyrone. Okay, thank you. Alrighty. So this is from the valuation that you can find on the Irish Times site, and I plugged in the name there. And back at that time, there was 14 households in Tyrone, 7 in Longford, 2 in Waterford, and 1 in Belfast. And it's the Tyrone tallies that we have in our project. They are R1b. And there's also some tallies that migrated out of Londonderry into Canada in the late 1800s. I have found them on the census. So that's one source of the Tally surname that has been validated by a DNA surname project as being Irish. Now, a second source of possible Tally DNA is Tally Abbey. It's in Wales. And, whoops, wrong button, sorry. Okay, alrighty. So the top picture there is an artist's rendition of how the Abbey looked originally. And then this is the ruins today. And an associate of mine told me about a tally record that was located in the College of Arms. And I discussed it with their representative. I was also at Who Do You Think You Are this past February. And so from the States there, I got up with them, and I was able to get a photocopy of a John Tally, who is associated. He was a cleric at Tally Abbey. Now, this is a screenshot. This is Welsh, and I had this translated. And it gives a pedigree of John Tally. Well, unfortunately, I was told that if he was a cleric, that he would not have any children. So, and there's also another cleric by the name of David Tally. So, Family Search has community trees on their website, and they've got one for Welsh and Wales. And so I went on out there and I discovered John Tally. The other thing about John Tally, the cleric that this Welsh record is referring to, he took on the name of Tally. That was not his father's name, and that was also not his brother's surname that descended down with his children. So it's a source, it's still a possible source that other people that were living in the town of Tally, because it was a location, but the records have not been found. So this is a work in progress. But this is how we're taking each piece and seeing where it fits in with the DNA, where it fits in with the genealogy. The third source, and my husband is the Tally descendant. Now, this location for Tally intrigues me. My husband has a lot of UK, Irish, Scottish, British, and I'd like to think that maybe he has some French ancestry too. But there's a town in Tallyburg called Tallyburg. And the land around Tallyburg was Henry II. It came into his hands. And then his son, King John, lost it. And then King John's son, Henry III, he still owned parts of France, present-day France, Gascony, and a few other areas there, but he tried to take Tallyburg back. And so Henry III fought with Louis IX, and Louis IX won. And this is Tallyburg Castle. This is the remnants, and that is where the battle was fought. And this is a painting by Eugene Delacroix of the battle. And the reason why I say Tallyburg is that Tally, that's the surname. It was spelled Taille in France. And YDNA travels, especially in times of conflict. And it is not out of reach to think that Tallies would have migrated either with the soldiers or just since that was British land at the time, because we find Tallies, we lose about 200 years between when they show up. They show up in Devon and they show up in ports like Gosport, Portsea, and that's where we find Tallies. So our project, we're hoping to eventually find some Tallies in this area, and we're also actively recruiting for Tallies in this area because we know that the Tallies here are R1b, the Tallies in France are I, a subclad of I. So that's another project, and having the DNA helps with the theory and trying to figure out where your surname first came from. Okay, my other project, and this is also my husband is, and his ancestry is all southern between North Carolina, South Carolina, and Virginia. And it has been real convenient for me over the years to research his family. And I have had a lot of success with lay. So this part of my presentation is when a lay is a lay, or, because these are all lays. Lee, of course, is pronounced Lee, but there's some people, that's an anglicized version, but I have all found known family members with the different spellings. So you really can't be sure. We have several lay testers from Wiltshire in England, and they don't match each other. So it is diverse it is as diverse in England as it is in the States. Here in Ireland, the choice spelling is Leigh, lay. Morris took me to the National Library just a couple days ago, and I gleaned some new clues where I found this spelling, Ley, and within the same document, Lee, and they were in Offaly. And this was about 3 generations between, I think it was 1535 on up to 1586, and they had land that was they leased from Queen Elizabeth. And the interesting thing is, though, is this particular family that I just recently found, and with that spelling, it looks like after Cromwell came through in the mid-1600s, it looks like they're not there. So I'm very interested in Morris's Irish Caribbean project to see if they were one of the ones transported, and when Charles II was giving back some of the land, that they weren't here to get it back. So these are some examples from my lay project. One of the things I always hear about is, well, I don't match anybody, or, the surname's not the same. Well, this is Professor Leigh. He's teaches at the University of Virginia, and he's into architecture. And he has a paper trail back to Ley, and it's German, and it's in Pennsylvania, and it goes back to right after the Revolutionary War. Well, he doesn't match any of the others in our lay surname project. We had an LEH person test who had taken the paper trail all the way back to Switzerland. He had tested first. Professor Leigh comes and tests, and they don't match. So he's at a loss. Who is the Leigh? Is the research wrong? Well, about 3 years later, in 2010, an LEH test from Pennsylvania, and they match. And so it's the first Mr. Leigh, LEH, and he's the one that did all the research back to Switzerland. He is the one that has something in his paternal ancestry that he's in a lay household, spelled L-E-H, but that is not his paternal surname going back. His research, though, has helped Professor Leigh and this Mr. Leigh, because they can trace back to Switzerland. My next example, and again, this is a Lee, L-E-E, and a Leigh, L-E-Y. And Mr. Leigh here, keep doing that wrong button, sorry. Okay, Mr. L-E-Y, he came into the States, into Ohio in the 1880s. Mr. Lee up here, his ancestors came into the New York area during colonial times. They didn't know where they were from in Germany, but Mr. Leigh did. So when they matched, they were able to bridge the gap. Mr. Lee was able to go back into Württemberg, Germany, but he would not have been able to do that without Mr. Leigh. And Mr. Leigh, L-E-Y, discovered genetic cousins that he didn't know about because they came in the late 1600s, early 1700s. They migrated out. Now, this is a cousin of my husband. This Mr. Leigh, he's a former banker out there on the Outer Banks of North Carolina on the coast. Now, if you notice all his matches here, it might be hard to see, but he's got L-A-Y, L-E-I-G-H, L-E-E, L-E-A. And all these are considered are matches here. And one thing we discovered is that this particular branch of the Lays, when they show up in the States, they're LAY. And I've already mentioned that even in UK, where we know they came out of, that LAY, there's so many branches that they don't even match. It's very diverse. What we found out, and then somebody actually found a record in one of the parishes, is that this particular lay branch was LEE in England there, in Wiltshire, and we've actually found a parish register now where it lists the births of 3 brothers. Now, 2 things about this test here is, notice this Mr. Lee here. He's saying that his oldest ancestor is Owen Lee from Orange County, North Carolina, born 1761. Okay, this is where you can merge sometimes the YDNA, the results of the YDNA, and then an autosomal family finder test. Because my husband can't test the YDNA because his lay DNA is through his mom. So this man has an ancestor of Owen Lee, and so my husband and his mother and his maternal uncle, they keep getting matches in the database with people who descend from Owen Lee of Orange County. So we're getting a hit there. We're researching. Now, they may not match on the Family Finder test with this Lee YDNA tester, but the fact that this is my husband's cousin, YDNA has proven that, and this keeps coming up as a common ancestor, is that it gives us a good clue and a good probability that that's ground zero. That is where we can start looking at the paper trail, the records. So that is when so many people get in the database and start sharing their names. So we're real excited about that find. Now, another interesting, the banker I was just talking about, he is in this green group. This is just a brief snapshot of my project. And I'm not so much for the numbers, the statistics in this presentation. It's more for the actual family history story. Is that the paper records have traditionally merged these 2 lines, the blue and the green. YDNA testing came along, and there's an error in the paper trail. These testers are hitting the different spelling variations of lay. So we can pretty much know that this surname has stayed true from its original origin in England there. These lays up here, who were supposed to match the greens, they have a lot of matches with the Brooks surname. And some of the Brooks have done their paper trail back into England. So there's a high probability there that there's an event in there that the earliest lay ancestor was in a lay household, but his paternal ancestry is not a lay. So we are looking into the Brooks there. This yellow group is interesting. This Isaac Lay only exists on paper. There has been multitude of researchers because the descendants of Isaac Lay have been out there in force for generations. And he only is on paper for a county history, where somebody said that this was my father, I descend from so-and-so, and going on back to this Isaac Lay. We thought DNA could help them. We thought because they're in the same area that they were going to match this green group. Well, these 2 last testers here, they're cousins, and as you can see, they're an exact match. And this is, they've taken their markers further on out, but for presentation purposes, we're just showing the 12 here. This is from another brother of another son of this Isaac Lay, and he doesn't even match. So now we have descendants of the other brothers, and they don't even match to the descendants of the other brother. So in everyday terms, this line is still a mess. DNA still has not solved their mystery. They have moved on to autosomal DNA. They do have surname matches. These are R1Bs, and there's not even a common surname with their matches. So anyway, there's still a deck of cards just thrown up. Okay, let's see, make sure I didn't skip one. Oh, okay, all right. So one of the things that I am trying to use autosomal DNA testing for is this is my husband's, this is my mother-in-law, Betsy Bonds, and this is her line going all the way back to William Talley. Elizabeth here, the paper trail, there's a family Bible that Frederick Talley's wife was Elizabeth. Well, Elizabeth who? That does not help me out. So my husband's got this huge gap in his pedigree chart that has just been, I've just been itching to fill. I don't like blank spots on a pedigree chart. Now, Fred Talley died before censuses came out where all the people in the household was enumerated. Fred Talley, we have not been able to find a marriage record. At least in North Carolina and Virginia back at that time, you did not have, you could tack on your marriage notice in front of the church so that everybody knew you were getting married. It's not necessary, it wasn't necessary to actually have the piece of paper. You could just make notice that the marriage was happening. And then they also had what we call itinerant ministers and preachers that would do the circuit and marry people. So we have not been able to find Fred Talley's wife. We just have this family Bible. So here is how DNA that I'm using to try and back into her maiden surname. For mtDNA, there's no known daughters of Frederick or Elizabeth, and they're not known, and so obviously they're not proven there. There is a female in a census household, but without having her name, that's a dead end right now. YDNA has given us a possible clue, and then the autosomal DNA is also assisting. There's been a descendant of Abraham Talley test, and he matches Betsy. The same thing with a Stephen Talley. That descendant is matching Betsy. Now here's the interesting part. My theory is that Elizabeth was a petty pool, and that's what I'm working on. That's what I eventually hope, not so much to prove with DNA, but to use DNA to find the paper trail, because it goes hand in hand with the paper trail to say she was a petty pool. So, as more people have entered the database, I've got a Lawrence here, and he matches Betsy, and he matches the descendant of Stephen Talley. And this Barry Talley, who's sitting all by himself, he was living when his father passed away. When Barry Talley passed away, one of his sons, Charles Barry, I found him living in the household of Allen Glass Talley. So, when the descendant of Barry Talley tested, guess what? He has the YDNA of a petty pool. So, does that mean that possibly a cousin came to live into this household? Because Allen Newberry, because he's having his son live with them. And so it starts to hopefully combine the families. The other thing I need to be careful about is because this Stephen Talley married Margaret Talley, and she also descends from a Seth Pettypool, who going up that line runs into this William Pettypool. So what happens when you have cousins married, which did happen a lot in the southeastern states because land was very important, and so cousins married a lot. I want to say first cousins, but cousins married quite frequently to keep the land in the family because that was most valuable. So where we're at right now is I'm using a term that I'm not really going to go into in my presentation, but it's called phasing, where we look at the specific chromosomes where these people match, and we start seeing, well, does this person match this person also? So we're not going off without taking in consideration that the DNA match might be with a cousin, but there was a cousin marriage, or if because there was a cousin marriage between two people of the same surname, that somebody down here has more DNA than what they normally would have. So that is just one of the things you can do with ATDNA. Another thing too is the X chromosome, but right now we don't know, because if there's a daughter that descends from Fred and Elizabeth Talley, not only would that daughter have her mtDNA, but there would be the X chromosome passing on down through the lines. So that is an ongoing project. Okay, another mystery now. This is my grandmother. This is Julia Estelle Milord. And this is what the paper trail says, that her mother was Cora Coulter and Robert Milord, and taking the lines back. Okay, the cousins used to taunt Julia and say that they knew something that she didn't. And when my mom was growing up, she heard the same thing, and it got passed down to me, that Julia was actually the daughter of what she knew as her aunt and her aunt's husband. And that particular couple, and you have to realize this was around 1910, Cora's sister Testa, she married a Jew, a Jewish storekeeper. And back in the early 19th century, that was to have a Protestant marry a man of Jewish faith, that was frowned upon, and by both families. So the story in the family is that Cora and Robert, oh shoot, I don't want to do that. I'm sorry. Can I get you? Okay. All right. Well, the family story is that Cora and Robert had a baby that died. And so Testa and Sam also had a baby, but their marriage was frowned upon, and they didn't want to raise a child that had, at that time, now we have to understand that this was over 100 years ago, and the culture norm, raise a child of two different faiths. And that was a major difference, Jewish and Gentile there. So the story is they gave their daughter to Cora and Robert to raise. There we go. All righty. So I've been DNA testing, ATDNA testing. I have multitudes of cousins that have culture in their background. So I can be assured that her mother is a culture. But is it Cora or is it Testa? DNA has not been able to reveal that because they're sisters. Okay, now we have Robert Milord. Okay, getting back to Sam, I tracked down he had numerous brothers and he had numerous sisters. Well, I have brought the lines down and I found 3 different testers from each of the siblings, of a few of the siblings to test. Now, one thing about Jewish ancestry, if you have Jewish ancestry, it shows, just because of their population structure, it shows up in your DNA test. Now, through my Polish background, I have a very distant Jewish ancestry that appears to be coming out of Lithuania, and it matches with my family tradition stories I heard growing up. But I did not have close enough Jewish matches with me to suggest that Sam would be my great-grandfather. When the family tested, Sam's family tested, none of them matched me. None of them matched my brother. So I can rule out that the story of Testa and Sam, that Sam is not her father there. But I have not been able to match with anybody in Robert Millard's family. So there's still a mystery. I have proven, I have validated. I don't like to say the word proven because when it comes to genealogy, there's always some new piece of paper, some new evidence that might suggest others. But DNA has validated that the Coulters are my ancestry. This Milord line here is a work in progress. So these have been stories. These are just pictures from both my husband's family and my family. Everybody here has pictures just like that. And so the theme of my talk has been to show you what DNA has done for my family history. I've done the research, paper research. I try and keep up with all the scientific advances to help with my projects. The scientific terms you hear, SNPs, haplogroups, mutations. I try and keep up with that, but I personalize them, to my family situation, my family stories. And this is my challenge to all of you, is that DNA, it's the stories of divisions, bonding, and mystery. And once upon a time, if you've got a brick wall, if you've got a hole in your genealogy, if you've got a huge patch in your pedigree chart that you diligently tried to find the paperwork, DNA is definitely a genealogical resource to use. You might find out things that you didn't know or validate, and you might find out things that, oh my goodness, I don't want to know that. Because the DNA is in us. You can't make errors with the paper trail, as far as merging families and a paper trail, taking somebody's family and adding it to your pedigree, and it may not be. The DNA, it's recorded in our DNA. And you've been a very great audience. And any questions, or there you go.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. That was really fantastic. Who has questions for Cynthia? Anybody got any questions? I have a question.
Like that.
Well, I've got a question. It's about when I was looking at your family tree, I was very envious of the fact that you were able to get back into the 1700s. And with the Betty pools, it looks like you've gone back even into the 1600s. Well, that's something that we only really dream of here in Ireland. How likely is it that we would be able to tie in to one of these US colonial trees that go way back into the 1600s through DNA?
Well, by testing number one, when you get your match names, and if it's in the US, I don't get discouraged if you don't have anybody that's here in Ireland, because the U.S. genealogy, they have been researching, and their records do go back into colonial times. Just within the last week or so, I was looking at an autobiography of actually a man with a Talley surname, and in the biography of him, it said that William Talley, or I should say John Wesley Talley, that was his name, married Elizabeth Ralston, son of John Ralston, who came with his two brothers right after the Revolutionary War from Ireland. So if somebody's a Ralston and they come upon that and can take the female, the lines coming down from this John Wesley Ralston, it's going to be on the outer bands of how the Family Finder test is reliable. It might be on the outer bands, but it still could be used to trace back using that Ralston as an example. For the YDNA, if you could hook into somebody who's done the research and knows that they came from Ireland in 1722, and it's been passed down in their family history and where they came from Ireland, then, and if that YDNA line matches, then that's a clue. You can start looking in areas there. That's how you can use. There's been such a huge Irish migration over the centuries outward that there's a lot of living relatives out there now who are DNA testing that are actually trying to come back this way, that your test would help them the same way their test would help you. Is that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the ability to piggyback onto somebody else's research is a very, very important point. Because I've certainly done it when I DNA tested. I found people that I matched with who had done their family tree much further back than I had hoped to do. And the fact that we actually matched each other meant that somewhere along those ancestors that they had found is going to be one of my ancestors, one of my great-great-great-great-great-grandparents. So that puts you in the direction of looking for further documentary evidence to try and establish a paper link. But certainly the genetic link between my family tree and this extensive genealogy that goes back is it points me in the right direction. It tells me where I should look.
Yeah.
Question over from Sean.
Just a quick point. From historical documentation, verses and poems, I recently, unbeknown to me, was told a little poem that quoted about trainers and McKennas never being very far apart. And I'd never heard this, so I Googled it and brought up the poem. And apparently it's quite well documented. So I just happened to mention it to a lady downstairs who was at the North of Ireland Family History Society stand. And she started discussing about where she'd put some of her posts. I said, well, that's very familiar to me. I said, I answered a post about that on the Macara message board on Facebook, and she said, oh, that was me. So just by sharing documentation and sharing little rumours that we hear and sharing verses and poems and historical documents, I think is a good way to find out history that we don't know would take us years to document otherwise. So that's something that I keep at the back of my mind now. So if you hear a phrase or hear a reference or something like that, Google it. Now, going on to another story, up in Ballymena there's a trainer headstone in an old churchyard, and it said so-and-so trainer died in Peshawar in 1880, I think it was, 17th of December 1880. Well, knowing that there's a lot of diversity in the Antrim pronunciations of townlands, I went through hours searching on Sean Road, the Ire Atlas, trying to find a townland starting off with Pesh, ending in O, W in the middle. And in the end I thought, no. I googled the date in Peshawar and found out that there was a battle in India. right? So this Ballymena man was out in a battle in Peshawar in the Khyber Pass in 1880. Well, who would have thought? Who would think a Ballymena man would be out there? You know.
Google is great.
So Google everything, even rumours.
You are. Families in British India.
Oh, there you go.
Thank you.
I was going to, I'm very new to DNA, and I just had done the whole lot, the mitochondrial. And what I was, I don't know quite how it happens, because I would have thought my mother's family is, as far as I know, totally Scottish. My father and my grandmother were born in India, and I have found that I have 7 generations in India, going back to 1796. But the thing is that my DNA is showing 95% European and 4.5% Asian, Indian. So is that from my father or is it from my mother?
Excuse me.
Bless you. Do you want some,
Well, one thing about, excuse me. One thing that I keep seeing with these percentages that a person has to keep in mind, excuse me, is that there has been a lot of migration. We don't give our ancestors credit enough for the movement in populations that they did. A lot of it has not been, history has not been 100% recorded. So as far as movement goes, unless we were there, we truly don't know. And when I discovered with this Mongolian ancestry there, I was reading, and I'm gonna, full disclosure here, I'm kind of nerdy when it comes with books, and I read. So I was reading a very interesting, it's called Of Plagues and People, and it was talking about diseases and plagues that have moved out of Asia into Europe, including the Black Plague. And we all know about Marco Polo and the Silk Route. Well, there was a cleric who was a foreign ambassador to the king of France, that he went eastward into China, and he was surprised, and he actually wrote this down, that in China he discovered a French woman that grew up with him in another town over. She had been kidnapped and hauled clear across the continent to China, and that's where he found her. So that is just one case. That's an extreme case of movement, but there has been a lot of migration. When you see those percentages and you see something that looks very strange, not only is this type of DNA testing in its infancy, it's in beta testing really. You have to consider, if you get something oddball, that there's not enough people in the database to compare it to yet. Number one, and number two, that maybe when enough people get in the database, that it's either going to change or that might become true, because we simply do not have all the facts, all the movements in population over the years. And the percentage testing where it says you're so much European, so much Asian, is not quite there. I mean, customers want it, so the DNA companies provide it, but it's still in beta testing.
Great, we have time for one more question.
Maybe this was covered in an earlier lecture, but I tested a number of years ago when there was 12 and 25. I started with 37, upgraded to 67 markers. My surname is Doherty, a Donegal name, but my family is from North County Kerry. My closest match was another Doherty who's one of my best friends. His family's from County Clare, just across the Shannon. I've upgraded to 67 markers. He's gone up to 111. I haven't done that yet. Like, I've been here 3 weeks, and about a week before I left, people mentioned this family finder test. You mentioned it here too. They were telling me how they really refined how closely they were related. Everything I had done previously basically had the graph that you had to look at that said, well, there's either an 80 or 90 or 98% chance you're related within so many generations, which would be 300-400 years. Does this new test really refine it?
Well, you're talking about two different tests. Where you test 12, 25, 37, 67, and 111 markers, that's the YDNA.
Yes.
Right. Okay, the Family Finder is testing your DNA that you got from both your father and your mother. And so it's reliable within the last 5 generations. So, whereas the YDNA is you're testing that one paternal line, it's a refinement as far as when you think of your whole pedigree chart.
Okay.
You can't compare the Family Finder to just the YDNA. So you're getting more information because you're getting matches across the spectrum from your mom over to your father, the maternal grandfather, everything that mtDNA and YDNA can't test because it only deals with one surname. So that's the refinement that they're talking about, and it expands your DNA for your family history. That's what the Family Finder does.
And the mtDNA test is a prerequisite then for the Family Finder?
No.
Okay. Thank you.
I'll be talking about the Family Finder test in the next presentation, so I'll be going into it in very, very great detail. Great, well listen, thanks very much for your kind attention, ladies and gentlemen. Can I ask you to give a round of applause one more time? Thank you.